Buses must have been invented by the popular crowd's fathers. Philip had decided that was true. Fathers who thought 50 kids driving along early in the morning would just love the social outlet that these buses would provide. Fathers who saw their children every day riding in the prime seats, telling all of the nerds, geeks, and social lowlifes where to go, what to do, and when to do so. This to them would certainly not seem bad. Certainly kids understood that they could not all be masters. Somebody had to rise to the top of the cream. Philip hated the bus. Riding back and forth every day to Greeley Elementary, where he attended 5th grade, and every day it was always the same old story. Maybe if half the kids knew what his mornings were like, even half of the time, it would be different, but probably not. Philip wasn't sure why he kept trying to attribute human decency to the pigs. He wasn't sure why he kept thinking that if they just understood him better, they would be less bestial. He knew in his heart of hearts that had they known what his home life was like, the treatment would only get worse. After all, this was the American public education system, and kids do, after all, have to learn that the cruelty they seem to be so proficient in later in life somewhere. Even at his young age, Philip had come to terms with the fact that all children felt inferior to all others. There was just always the ones that were better at disguising it than the others, and this exercise of disguising usually came at his expense. Take, for example, Paul Ritzberg, the kid who always claimed the back seat, even if somebody was already sitting in it. Philip was sure that Paul went home every day and did the same things most of the other kids did. Played trucks in the mud, ran around with cowboys and Indians, or just sat on the swing set pretending to be Luke Skywalker in the next Star Wars movie. They were all the same, every single last one except for him. He had left his Matchbox cars behind him a long time ago in the shadow of a gravestone. His town filled with cheating mothers, working fathers, drug dealers, and non-innocent children who just became too real to be an escape anymore. He was sure that there weren't very many others who went up the hill to talk to a long-dead missionary, or down to a pond where the little girl with the eyes of a seductress waited for him just to read Shakespeare. That's the other ghost, by the way. Maybe they had their imaginary friends, but that was the difference, and that is where their similarities ended. These kids had mothers who tucked them in at night. Nighty-night, Polly, don't let the bedbugs bite. Or fathers who went outside in the evening after dinner just to throw the ball around. Yes, he was sure he was different. He was the silent kid, he was the funny kid, he was the lonely kid, and he really just didn't give a shit where he sat on the bus. But still, kids compete continuously for dominance of their own little simple world. Philip was certain things had been this way forever, and he was just another freak at the bottom of the social climb. Buses, however, didn't help the situation. Rodney Rodham, a big kid whose family owned a farm at the end of Route 9, about 2 miles down from Philip's place, was the other figure of power on the weekday bus. Rodney Rodham was huge. Philip had seen him down at Old Man Chesterfield's farm once wrestling the farmer's award-winning hogs. Not quite the pastime Philip thought worthy of much respect, but who really listened to him anyway. And Rodney Rodham, the bus bully of Greeley, hated Philip. "Hey, faggot." It was the usual greeting as he walked towards the boy on the bus. It was also the cue for anyone sitting behind Philip to find another seat, which they promptly did. Rodney sat down, leaned forward, placed his face against Philip's bench, with his chin resting just next to Philip's ear. He then began to tap the back of Philip's head, each tap a little closer to the hard thump than the last. "So, thump, faggot." Thump, thump. "What's for lunch today?" Philip, whose face reddened quickly no matter how used he was to the treatment, sat there and stared straight ahead. He never flinched, he never blinked. "Did you hear me, faggot?" Thump, thump, thump. "What kind of pansy pictures do we have in our book today?" Thump. The boy's huge body slid over the seat as he lunged for the sketch diary Philip held like the Holy Bible on his lap. "What do you got here, faggot?" Rodney's hands lashed out for the book, but Philip's reflexes were quick, and he moved it out of reach. Thump, 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 thump. "Give it to me, slick dick." Thump. "Give it to me now or you're going to feel the pain." Philip's face was red and flushed in anger, but his eyes were like sparks. His hands were gripped tightly around his sketch diary so hard that his knuckles were turning shades of blue and finally fading into a stark white, and his mouth began to whisper the words, "Give me this, give me that. I'm going to splatter your mama's cat." "What?" Rodney bellowed in a type of surprised shock that Philip even dared to talk. "What are you going to do, faggot?" Thump. "Going to kill it with a neck slap, just like that." Philip thought he was still whispering. He thought he was just mouthing the rhyme as a way to ignore what was being said and done to him. But the surprised look on Rodney's face told him that he had heard him, and the look of terror that followed him told him that he must be screaming. And the tears on Rodney's face told him that something even more terrible was happening. But still he continued. "I'll break the neck and smash the teeth. I'll pull the hair and the skin beneath. I'll shoot the head and chew the tail. And when I'm done, Rodney Rodham, when I'm done, he'll come for you." Philip's throat hurt from screaming, and his eyes burned like they were seared by hot coals. Beside him a shadow was forming, the shadow of a tall man with a missionary's wide-brimmed hat, and looming in supernatural darkness next to the wild boy, and still screamed out words. "He'll scrape your bones across teeth of steel." The shadow inside looked on, and saw that it was good. "And when he's done, he'll suck your blood and leave you as a husked shell. And then, Rodney Rodham, when he's done," the word suddenly became a vision in Philip's mind. And with the visions came the realization that he wanted to stop the song right then. He could see Francis biting into Rodney's fat neck and looking up with blood shining and gleaming all over his face and chin. He could see glistening white teeth stained with blood and gore. He could see their twisting shapes plunging into waiting flames. He wanted to bite off his tongue so that he couldn't complete the chant. He wanted to go blind from the vision and the horrifying looks all around him. But the shadow at his side urged him on, but with a nudge, and the words came pouring out and the prayer was completed. "And when he's done, Francis, he'll drag you straight to hell." Suddenly the shadow on his side exploded with a heat and intensity that sent Philip flailing into the center aisle to escape being burned. He covered his face and clutched the sketch diary beneath him. He covered his eyes and his arms, and Philip Ormine tried to ignore the sounds of the perfect horrifying silence. He tried to shut out the visions of all of the sketches of Francis composed and drawn out in shades of gray lead, hiding in the sketch diary. Francis was on the stone, Francis with the burning eyes, Francis the missionary, Francis the angel, Francis the protector, and finally Francis the avenger. Philip didn't want to see them. He didn't want to imagine anything at all, but most of all he didn't want to know what power he had unleashed with a simple little rhyme. Later that night, after all of the events of the day were past and he was home, after all of the questions at the school psychologist's office, after the ride home with Sheriff Cuthbert, after the beating he received from his father, and after the mobs had been chased back home for the evening, after they had taken Rodney's body back home to his mother, after all of it, Philip laid in his bed trying to make himself forget that Francis, his best friend and confidant, was a demon. Everyone in town attended Rodney's burial ceremony, everyone except the Ormonds and Sheriff Cuthbert. The sheriff spent the day, in fact, either himself or one of his deputies, spent every hour around the clock for weeks, sitting on the front porch of the Ormond house with a shotgun, in case any would-be revenge seekers were to happen by looking for the demon child. Ty, his father, sat drinking beer after beer and watching television. Julia Ormond smoked a continuous cigarette, one after the other lit from the dying bit of the previous, stared at the pond from the dilapidated back porch. And their son, Philip, the demon child, stood in his attic bedroom, staring at the window at the gravestone on top of the hill, the stone with the ancient inscription that read, "A light on a hill cannot be hid." After long thought and debate, the boy began to cry. He had said almost nothing for days after the incident. He hadn't cried out when his dad beat him. He hadn't cried when the doctors asked him questions. Instead, he sat almost like a mute, thinking it all over and over in his mind. But here, after days of silence, the tears began. They were not, however, tears of sadness or pity, but rather tears of joy. Philip Ormond conversed with angels, and even if Francis was a fiery demonic angel from hell, he was his guardian, and he was the only person that really loved him at all. One of the things that's been interesting about the book in general is it's told through a bunch of characters' points of view. And so that kind of leaves you, it doesn't really tell you what happens on the bus. And you jump into chapter 2 and it's told from a totally different perspective. It's the character's name is Katrina, and she's basically a girl that's had this kind of weird crush that you can't admit in school on the painter. And so when we jump into her mind, she starts remembering back to what happened on the bus from a different point of view.
This particular